Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to reveal my most disappointing books of 2019. People love hearing all the dirt on books or anything really. We love the negative stuff. Interestingly enough though, and I think anybody else who's filmed one of these videos would agree, like being the most disappointing book of a year doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad book. Being disappointing has more to do with my expectations than it does the actual quality of a particular book. So I don't pick up a book that I don't think I'm going to love. I only set out to read books that are going to be 5 stars. It's impossible. Not every book that I read can be 5 stars, but I definitely don't pick something up without first imagining that it's great. I have pretty high expectations, I guess, or I set very high expectations for books. So today I'm just going to tell you about some books that didn't live up to those expectations. First on this list is 99% Mine by Sally Thorne. I read this book relatively early in 2019, and I read it because I had heard how great The Hating Game was. I had heard how phenomenal Sally Thorne was. And I wanted to be one of the first people to report that 99% Mine was also phenomenal. I didn't read The Hating Game until later in the year, but I just knew that The Hating Game had been a gigantic sensation and 99% Mine was going to be as well. 99% Mine is the story of twins Darcy and Jamie. And as young kids, they befriended another boy named Tom. Tom and Jamie ran around together all the time, and Darcy sort of developed this crush on Tom. As adults, Darcy has hired Tom to help renovate her grandmother's cottage or house that she received as an inheritance. And we see the crush sort of, it's a friends to lovers romance essentially between Darcy and Tom, with Darcy's twin brother Jamie putting his 2 cents into the story here and there. This book was a hot mess. So what disappointed me about this book was not the actual story. It was not the actual concept. It was not the fact that it was friends to lovers. And no, it was written poorly. It was a mess. It was not plotted well. It had character inconsistencies. There was just, it just felt like something that was very rushed. It felt almost like a draft. It felt unedited. I couldn't believe how bad it was after I'd heard such phenomenal and amazing things about Sally Thorne. I was really let down and disappointed in this experience. I, pre-ordered, paid full price for this book. And yes, like the amount you invest in a book does contribute to the amount of disappointment one may feel. It was just a gigantic letdown. I have my theories for why this happened because, later on in the year I did read The Hating Game and it was mind-blowingly good. So I definitely have some theories about the sophomore performance from Sally Thorne. I think it was rushed. I think, under the pressure of replicating the success of The Hating Game, plus maybe some time lost over a sophomore book that had already been announced but then got shelved. I think that the mess you end up with in those scenarios is 99% Mine. It's just bad. It's just bad. And I want to say to Sally Thorne, like, girl, take your time and write the book you want to write. And those are all things that I've theorized had to do with the failure of 99% Mine. So I did start out by saying that not every book on this disappointment list would be a bad book, but unfortunately, in this case, this was a poorly produced work. And it was a huge disappointment. Next on this list is the book The Last by Hannah Jameson. This is the story of a man who is, I believe, on a business trip and staying in a hotel in the Swiss Alps when nuclear war happens and most of the world is destroyed. Just being in a remote place saves this group of people staying in this hotel, and they have to try to survive. They have to try to rebuild their lives knowing that much of the world around them has been destroyed. And this happens more often than it should. Here's where I call out publishers. Do not market a book as something that it isn't. Like, that is probably my number one pet peeve when it comes to reading, selecting books. Like, a book marketed as something that it isn't infuriates me. And unfortunately, The Last was marketed as this mystery thriller where this murder takes place in the middle of this apocalypse and new dystopian environment, and how are these people going to survive? It was supposed to be very survivalist and, you know, this murder mystery, and it's totally not. This is a very slow moving kind of character study, how you rebuild society, like how society rebuilds itself when it's drilled down to very little. I mean, this book, there's political things in this book, but overall this was a gigantic letdown, and I couldn't enjoy the book for what it was because I was promised it was going to be something else. And so this happens constantly. I can't tell you how often a book is billed as some super thriller when, or some super mystery, when it's actually just this contemporary literary general fiction kind of story. And to be honest with you, I don't think that does the book any favors. Like, there's a whole bunch of people out there that would love to read this book. Maybe they didn't pick it up because it sounded too much like a thriller, and they don't have time for thrillers. Meanwhile, thriller readers who picked up this book were super excited to read it, and all across the board were like, what the hell? What the hell? This isn't the kind of book I like to read. So it's just a huge mistake. Huge. Don't do it. If you publish books, if you're marketing for books, just don't do it. I only DNF'd 2 books in 2019, 2 or 3 books, I don't know. But the first one that I DNF'd was Nosferatu by Joe Hill. And I did a big video about it. I was really fired up. I was really pissed off. I had just DNF'd it when I filmed that video. I was mad. And the reason that I was mad is because I had sort of convinced myself that Joe Hill was going to be an author I would love, and that Nosferatu would probably be my most favorite book of his. Why did I convince myself of that? I'm not sure. It's a combination, I think, of like reputation. You know, he has a built-in legacy because his father's Stephen King. The concepts of his books sound horrifying. Nosferatu sounded great. It's a story of a girl who has the ability to kind of teleport or transport herself to wherever she needs to be, and throughout her past it's become very handy for finding things, finding lost things. And meanwhile, we have this immortal villain who is stealing children and taking them to a fantastical place called Christmas Land, and they stay there frozen forever. And so I didn't read the whole book, but essentially I'm guessing that this protagonist girl is the only one that could get to Christmas Land to save these children, yada yada, or could find it or whatever. It's a horror novel, and it's unfortunately a horror novel that I thought would I would really like. But I didn't. I will leave the video linked that I made for it. But what it boils down to is, I think, the same thing that it kind of happened to me later in the year when I started reading King. The characters, I didn't care about the characters. Like, there wasn't enough redeeming qualities about the characters to make me care about them. It was very cringy. That's what it comes. The book was very cringy. Not only did I not care enough about the key players in the book, like the protagonist, and I'm not talking about likability. Like, I didn't care about her. Like, I didn't care what happened to her. I had no interest or investment in her well-being whatsoever, whether I liked her personally or not. But on the other hand, the book was just very cringy. The things that Joe Hill wanted to highlight were not the most horrifying things in the book. They were actually just really cringy. It was cringy. And ultimately I started to feel like Joe Hill, as the author, thought it was all a big joke. That all of this was funny, that it was like supposed to be satirical, but it missed the mark. It's kind of how I feel. Like, I don't know. And it's just not for me. And I can't even say that it was a bad book, I guess. I mean, it's a very memorable book. It's probably a very standout book, especially once you've read it to completion. I really don't know. Ultimately, just not for me. Just not for me. Somewhere in the mix, in the middle of the year or so, I read Waiting for Tom Hanks by Carrie Winfrey. And this is the story of a girl who has always dreamed of working in the film industry. One day a production company announces that they're going to be shooting a film in Annie's hometown, and she manages to work her way into a job on set. She meets the leading man and detests him instantly. The thing about Waiting for Tom Hanks, I think, is that it had this epic title. And this epic, relatability, because this girl, Annie, is obsessed with romantic comedies and Nora Ephron and the romantic heroes that throughout time have famously been played by Tom Hanks. So it had this 5-star title, and I thought it was going to be super relatable. In reality, though, I hated Annie. Annie was unreasonable and spoiled and had expectations that no man could ever meet, whether he's a Hollywood heartthrob or not. I can't really remember if I felt like the problems were writing related or story related. The only things coming to mind are story related. Annie was just not a nice person. Her friend was very stereotypical. Oh gosh, it was just bad. Now going back and looking at it, I see that it's a book 1 in a 2-part series, and I'm just like, why would anybody do this? It was super disappointing. It was something that I really thought was going to be adorable and like deliciously cute, and it was so bad. Annie was so immature. Like I said, she was just not a nice person. I didn't want this super nice hero. What was his name even? What was his name? I wanted to say Tom, but Drew. Drew was a really nice guy in the book. He was super nice. And he took a lot of crap from Annie that I don't think he needed to take crap that he needed to take from her. So I wasn't rooting for this relationship. Like, I wanted Drew to pack up his trailer and run back to Hollywood and leave Annie in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio. So, but we don't get everything we want. The next one is weird. The next one is a book that I actually liked. It's called The Chain by Adrienne McKinty. And this is the story, amazing, amazing concept. This is the story of a woman who gets a phone call that her daughter has been kidnapped. And in order to get her daughter back, she has to pay this outrageous ransom and kidnap someone else's child. And she will get her daughter back when the parents of the child she kidnaps a child. You see what I'm saying? So, I mean, it's an amazing concept, and you start thinking about it, about, oh my gosh, like, how do you convince somebody to not involve the police and instead kidnap someone else's child, and you've already committed this heinous crime by the time you find out whether or not the people behind you have done what they've needed to do to get your own child back. Like, you're no matter, like, you have to do this horrible thing, but it's not this horrible thing that gets your child back. You have to rely on somebody else doing horrible things. And it's like, it was just a mind-blowing concept to me. And honestly, the first half of this book, I was really involved, and I thought it was suspenseful and exciting. So what happened? Again, maybe a slight marketing problem, but I thought that the book would be all about this series of events. And it actually wasn't. Like, the series of events resolves itself rather quickly. And the rest of the book is about dealing with it. Like, dealing with horrible things that you've done. And dealing with the trauma of it all. Like, having a relationship, like, trusting anybody after that. And, like, moving on and watching your child who went through a traumatic experience be affected for years afterwards. I mean, it turned not so suspenseful and action driven and more character and, like, painful and heartfelt and sad. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying it was disappointing because I was amped up to read this super intense, action-filled book. And then it switched gears so suddenly into something that I didn't expect, that was disappointing. And then the end turned out to be kind of action movie stereotypical in a way. Like, you know, where people who don't have a lot of capabilities end up achieving pretty impressive things. It's the same problem I have with amateur sleuth stories. Like, there's something really unrealistic about, you know, someone in the PTA like taking down a criminal organization. I mean, that's not the exact circumstances of the story, so I was just using that as an example. But it turned a little bit like that. I still enjoyed it. It was an arc, and I liked it. I was surprised by it, and not necessarily in a good way. Finally is a book that I read in 2019 that I haven't even talked about in depth on this channel yet. And that is the book Cujo by Stephen King. What? Is Cujo a good book? For the right reader, absolutely. Am I the right reader for Cujo? Absolutely not. So again, this is just a case of expectations. And unfortunately, as a child of the 80s, there's some like Lego destruction going on out there. As a child of the 80s who lived through like the film Cujo, and being impressionable enough, or of an impressionable age, to find it terrifying, and to remember everybody around me saying how scary it was and everybody having like a super scary reaction to this, I was like, okay, I'm going to read the book. That's not exactly how it happened. But when I sat down at the tail end of 2019 to read the book, I was shocked. I was shocked. It was nothing like I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be the story of a rabid dog that terrorizes a mother and son, period. Another high tension, high action, high suspense situation on the page. No. I think it sounds terrible, but the damn dog doesn't even get rabies until, I don't know, way into the book. I remember being like 3.5 hours into the audiobook and asking the person who recommended it to me, like, I've consumed 3.5 hours of this book and I'm not sure why I need to know any of this. I'm not sure what any of this has to do with a dog. I'm not sure what any of this has to do. Like, how are we going to go from here to there? Because I know it's going there, but how, like, these things have nothing to do with each other. And that's the truth. Cujo is actually a story about, again, like Joe Hill, not very good people, not people without very many redeeming qualities. And I don't like that either. So I found it fascinating and interesting. If I like reading books like that, I would have probably loved Cujo. But that's not what I set out to do. It was my first King book that I completed, King novel that I completed, and definitely a real good indicator of his writing, how much detail he can put into a story, all of the things his brain processes just to write a story about a rabid dog that terrorizes a mother and child. Like, this became a 20 character book. I mean, and I know everything about those 20 characters, like everything, backstory and all. So, I mean, such a disappointment. But, I mean, it's Stephen King, so you can't say, oh, this is crap, because it's not crap. And like I said, it was interesting, just not what I wanted, not what I was hoping it would be. So in that regard, it was disappointing. Have you read any of the books that I mentioned? Did you like them? Were you also disappointed by them? Or tell me what your most disappointing book of 2019 is. Let's just get this all off our chests. Hopefully, if you love the books that I mentioned, then you can at least see where I'm coming from and you won't hold it against me, maybe. And we'll see. We'll see what happens in 2020. I would love to say that nothing in 2020 is going to disappoint me, but let's not be unrealistic here, folks. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all very soon.